Boy, she's got a noisy computer.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Colette Sedan-Beagley of the LGBT Resource Center, and we're so happy to have you here at our first ongoing LGBT conference of the academic year, so welcome. I'd like to just take a moment and ask you to make sure your cell phones are silenced so we don't hear songs competing with Who Are You in the middle of the presentation. You've each been given an evaluation. If not, Emily has them right here and Anthony has them at the back. And we'd like you to take a moment to fill out the side that says, please share the following, so that you don't have to do that at the end. And that's just demographic information. Those evaluations are really important to us because we want to know if we're hitting it on the mark with our programming and meeting your needs. We want to hear your responses to each of our programs. So we really appreciate your taking the time. I know I personally hate filling out evaluations, so I really am appreciative of you taking the time to do that. Our next event is going to be on October 11th for National Coming Out Day, and we'll be showing the film A People's History of the LGBTQ Community in Grand Rapids. And it will be in this room, and it will be followed by a panel of history makers from our area. So we invite you to attend that on October 11th. And then our next all-student ally and advocate training will be on November 2nd. And if you're interested in learning more about how to be an ally to the LGBT community, we invite you to sign up for that training on our website. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Laurel Westbrook. She's assistant professor in the sociology department. Dr. Westbrook, along with her colleague, Kristen Schilt, too many vowels and consonants there. Kristen Schilt wrote the article, Doing Gender, Doing Heteronormativity, which received the Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award from the American Sociological Association. Dr. Westbrook is a popular professor who this winter will be teaching the sociology of sexuality and, for the first time on our campus, queer theory, which will be part of the upcoming LGBTQ minor. So we invite you to check those out and maybe sign up for her classes if that works for you. So at this point, please help me welcome Dr. Westbrook, who will be talking about determining gender and its consequences for transgender rights.
This mic I have on works, right? I don't need this, or not?
Yep.
Okay. So, thank you, Colette, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. This that I'm presenting today is also based off work with Kristen Schilt. It's a follow-up to that article that won that Fancy Pants Award. We realized that there were some holes in the past article. The past article was looking at what we're calling determining gender, deciding what gender a person is. We're looking at how it seems to be relatively not important in social situations when cisgender, meaning non-transgender people, encounter transgender people, but very important in sexual situations. This article, we're adding an analysis of sex-segregated spaces to try to make the theory of determining gender just a little bit more robust. So I just threw out a couple terms at you. I'm going to put them up here on the slide now. Cisgender, which I will also use the word cis or cis person in this talk, means gender identity lines up with the sex labeled at birth, and lines up means quotes. Whereas transgender, which I'll also use the word trans or trans person, is a case where gender identity is different than that traditionally associated with the sex they were labeled at birth. In the talk today, I'm going to explore our concept of determining gender. Determining gender is the practice of labeling others with a gender. And we developed this concept by looking at 3 case studies: debates over transgender employment rights, public policies determining eligibility for competition for transgender athletes, as well as proposals to remove the surgery requirement to change sex on birth certificates. This is a proposal done by New York City. That resulted in a whole lot of controversy. And our analysis of these 3 cases reveals that the criteria for determining gender vary across social situations. Our past work that I just mentioned has shown that cisgender people are often highly accepting of transgender people in non-sexual, non-sex segregated spaces. Kristen Schilt's dissertation work was on open transitions in the workplace, where employee went from identifying publicly as the gender that you would assume would go with their sex that they were labeled at birth, to transitioning, and seeing how cisgender people responded to that transition. And she found that, particularly for trans men, that employers and their coworkers were actually incredibly accepting, versus my dissertation data was on the murder of transgender people in the United States. And I found that many of these murders occurred in sexual situations where a cisgender person had a sexual interaction with a transgender stranger, discovered that the transgender person did not have the genitals they were expecting them to have, and decided to solve that problem with violence. So we find that social actors tend to enforce a rigid biology-based criteria for determining someone's gender in sexual situations, and this data adds sex-segregated spaces as well. So we find that there are different rules for gender in different social spaces, and that sex-segregated spaces are not evenly policed. As the criteria for access is rarely debated for men's spaces, in our analysis, men's spaces don't come up very much at all, whereas the main focus of what we're terming gender panics shows up regularly in women's spaces. Exploring the implications of the difference, we posit that bodies, mainly the presence or absence of a penis, matter for determining gender in women's spaces because of cultural ideologies of women as inherently vulnerable and in need of protection. Ideologies that reproduce gender inequality under the guise of protecting women. We argue that in the liberal moment of gender, which I'll explain more in a second, access to sex-segregated spaces is not determined by unchangeable measures such as chromosomes, but is instead determined by genitals. By using changeable bodily aspects to determine gender, the basic premise of the sex-gender sexuality systems is maintained as the system moves those people who might challenge it back into a clear zone of two opposite genders, right? So we're having this moment where there's transgender people that's somehow threatening to people's understandings of binary gender, and what do you do with this? Well, you let them move from one category to the other by changing their genitals, something that is changeable, which means you can solidify the sex-gender sexuality system by just moving these transgressors into safe categories. So, in the children's book Alice Adventures in Wonderland, the main character, Alice, encounters a hookah smoking caterpillar who, in place of saying hello, slowly asks, "Who are you?" Alice answers that she doesn't know anymore, so changed has she been by her stay in Wonderland. The caterpillar argues that it's silly for her to be confused, and Alice responds that after you have changed into a butterfly, I think you shall find it a little queer. In every encounter we have with others, we're consciously or unconsciously asking ourselves who, or better in this case, what that person is, particularly in terms of gender, but also, of course, in terms of race and sex, race, age, ability, etc. Like, what category can I place this person in? Usually when others are doing gender in a normative way, we don't notice this practice because the category placement is immediately obvious to us. But occasionally when we encounter someone whose gender is unclear, we may, much like the caterpillar encountering the 3-inch tall child, be more overt in our questioning. As been well established by gender scholars, gender is accomplished in interaction. We all do gender, meaning present our gender to others through the clothing we wear, how we behave, how we hold our bodies, etc. And people around us attribute a gender to us based off our self-presentation. This doing side of gender has been very well theorized by past scholars of gender. But what has not been theorized is the process of deciding a person's gender. And Kristen and I are terming this determining gender. So while most people believe that genitals determine gender, genitals aren't visible in social interactions, so we rely on cues to determine gender, such as clothing, facial hair, breasts, etc. These visual cues operate as what Susan Kessler and Wendy McKenna called cultural genitals. Basically, the genitals a person is assumed to have based off their cultural cues to others. Traditional beliefs about gender, where gender is determined by biology, mainly genitals, can be conceptualized as biology-based gender ideologies, whereas the belief that self-identity should determine gender is called the identity-based gender ideology. Since gender is a social process, the criteria for determining gender have changed over time. In the late 1960s, the United States encountered what Joanne Meyerowitz has termed the liberal moment in understandings of gender. New surgical possibilities, combined with a cultural turn towards liberalism, meaning values of self-determination and equality, resulted in a shift in the criteria for membership in a gender category from pure biology to a combination of self-identity and biology. The visibility of transgender people can create moments of potential conflict between this liberal impulse to embrace self-identity and a deep cultural belief that biological sex differences determine gender. To address this conflict, judges in the 1960s and 70s ruled that a person could legally change sex as long as she followed particular procedures, mainly undergoing a complete surgical sex reassignment, meaning genital reconstructive surgery, to move from one side of the gender binary to the other, right? A complete move from one box to the other was allowed with these judges' rulings. Staying in between was not. Thus, the possibilities for self-determination were limited by dominant understandings of the biology-based criteria for gender membership. With these criteria in place, dominant understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality, as well as liberal values of self-determination, were able to coexist. Now, trans people have been legally and medically acknowledged in the United States since the 1950s, but there's little cultural awareness of this population until the 1990s. And this is because medical professionals long insisted that in order to gain access to hormones and surgery, trans people must tell no one of their transition, right? The requirement for transition, if you wanted to get access to the medical care you wanted, is you had to completely separate yourself from your friends and family, move, change jobs, and tell no one that you had transitioned. This stealth model of transitioning began to dissipate in the late 1990s as transsexual, intersex, and transgender rights groups organized in an effort to gain greater cultural recognition and civil rights. With this push came wide coverage of trans people in the media, including debates about where trans men and women fit in institutions such as legal marriage and in public sex-segregated spaces such as bathrooms, prisons, and sports competitions. And it's these media debates that Kristen and I analyzed for the findings I'm going to present today. Here's the case study slide again. So, to explore the criteria for determining gender, we sought out mainstream media coverage of instances where biology-based and identity-based gender ideologies collided in contexts that were constructed as non-sexual. Remember, our previous work is sexual interactions, so we wanted to find non-sexual interactions where there was some conflict over where trans people fit. From the tons of conflicts we could have chosen, we picked the three that on the surface seemed the most different: sports participation, birth certificate policies, and employment non-discrimination laws. And for time reasons, I'm not going to go into detail about how we collected the newspaper articles about this, but suffice to say, there's a bunch of news about this. We analyzed that, and if you have questions about that, I can answer that at the end. We found that in these moments of ideology collision, gender categories are contested, which makes the process of determining gender much more visible. And while we didn't limit our search to sex-segregated spaces, it's these locales that appeared again and again as salient points of focus in the gender ideology debates. These cases show a strong cultural limit on gender self-determination in sex-segregated spaces, as discussion in the media of allowing people to self-determine their gender provoked what we term gender panics. So gender panics are situations in which social actors react to disruptions to biology-based gender ideology with frantic attempts to reassert the naturalness of a male-female binary. When successful, this labor, which we're going to term gender naturalization work, quells the panics. In our cases, enacting policies requiring body-based criteria for admission into these spaces ends the gender panic, right? So we have cases where there's a panic, and the way that you get rid of that, the gender naturalization work you do, is you say, okay, trans people can be in these spaces as long as they alter their bodies to fit our understandings of what is male or what is female. This resolution to the panic renaturalizes gender and bolsters the gender binary, confirming common sense ideas that gender is determined by genitals and that male and female are naturally occurring opposites. Because men's spaces and women's spaces gain their stability and form from the assumption of innate oppositeness, right? We believe that we should have men's restrooms and women's restrooms because men and women are opposite. That we should have men's sports teams and women's sports teams because men and women are opposite. So because these spaces gain their meaning from this idea of oppositeness between male and female bodies, biological credentials, mainly genitals, are the verification for gender truth in these spaces. While we intentionally went looking for non-sexual situations, we found that genitalia still becomes the determination point of gender, and in the end, it's often fears of unwanted heterosexuality that motivates the policing. So we went looking specifically for topics that weren't about sexuality, and what we found is, interestingly, sexuality pops up once again, because gender and sexuality are inextricably intertwined. So the calls for genitals as the arbiters of true gender in sex-segregated spaces thus becomes the hallmark of gender panics. Now into our cases. Modern athletic competition, like all sex-segregated spaces, rests on and reproduces an idea of two opposite genders. Because of its influence on other athletic organizations, we focused on policies enacted in 2003 by the International Olympic Committee, from here on out, IOC, that determine under what circumstances and in what categories transgender and intersex athletes can compete. So in the modern Olympics, all events are sex-segregated except for equestrian events. And in order to maintain this segregation, sports officials have to write policies on how to cope with cases of athletes that don't easily fit into a binary. The question of where to place transgender athletes in sex-segregated competitions first gained national attention in 1977 when, following the liberal tide of embracing self-identity, the New York Supreme Court ruled that Dr. Renee Richards, a post-operative transsexual woman, could participate in the U.S. Women's Open tennis tournament. This, of course, created a huge amount of controversy, saying that she was going to be cheating. The court, though, ruled that Richards could compete as a woman because she did not have a competitive advantage over other women, as she had had her testes removed and had been, quote, physically weakened by the resulting loss of testosterone. And she did not, in fact, win. Following a similar logic, the IOC adopted what was called the Stockholm Consensus in 2003, which allows trans athletes to compete in the gender of their choice if they've undergone bodily modifications that, quote, minimize gender-related advantages. So you're noticing a certain assumption about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman in this narrative, right? Men are strong, women are weak. So according to the IOC Medical Commission, the criteria for appropriate trans bodies are surgical anatomical changes have been completed, including external genitalia changes. Legal recognition of their assigned sex has been conferred by the appropriate official authorities, and hormone therapy appropriate for the assigned sex has been administered in a verifiable manner for a sufficient length of time to minimize gender-related advantages in sports competitions. The commission stated that an athlete would be eligible to compete as the gender they identified as no sooner than 2 years after the removal of their previous genitals. This criteria allowed the IOC to incorporate trans athletes and thus to validate the liberal moment of gender without challenging the premise that modern competitive athletics rests on, that there are two and only two genders, and all athletes must be put in one of those two categories for competition. The Stockholm Commission, with its biology-based criteria, in many ways quieted what was a slow-burning gender panic that began with Renee Richards and re-erupted with each new case of a trans athlete. Such cases raise questions about whether or not it's fair for a cisgender person to compete with a transgender person. The answer to this question hinges on which gender ideology you follow, right? So fair to who? While trans women might self-identify as women, people who subscribe to biology-based ideologies of gender continue to view these athletes as males who carried a size and strength advantage over females. The official goal of the Stockholm Commission was to be fair to all athletes, which meant that trans athletes could compete as the gender with which they identify, but only with the aforementioned criteria met. With this policy in place, cisgender people could have confidence that only trans women who are as weak as cis women were able to compete, a policy move that diffused this gender panic around trans athletes and upheld the logic of sex segregation. So that's case one. Here's case two. In the New York birth certificate case, a proposed policy intended to improve the lives of transgender people set off a fast-moving and powerful gender panic. In 2006, the city of New York proposed legislation to remove the surgical requirement for a change of sex on birth certificate. So previously, you could change sex on your birth certificate in New York, but you had to have a surgery on your genitals, and what it changed from was you no longer had a sex designation on your birth certificate at all, where other people would say M or F, yours was blank. You were basically officially genderless, according to the law. And so they decided to change that, and with a lot of activist work saying that many trans people don't have surgeries, in part because they're expensive, because they don't necessarily produce the bodies that trans people want, and because they don't think that they should have to alter their body to live as the gender they identify as. All of this activism produced this policy that was under, all expectations thought to pass. Politicians and transgender activists celebrated the amendment as cutting edge, a step towards easing the day-to-day lives of transgender people. Because before this, if you wanted your driver's license to reflect the gender you present as, you had to do surgery, which meant that you could be running around with a driver's license that has a sex that you don't look like, which makes for a very unpleasant traffic stop at 2 in the morning. Journalists initially presented the amendment in positive terms. However, the announcement of the proposed policy in November of 2006 resulted in an intensely negative public reaction. The Board of Health was inundated with calls and emails from people asking about how the change in the birth certificate policy would affect access to sex-segregated spaces, such as restrooms, hospital rooms, and prison blocks. To quell the panic, the Board of Health hastily withdrew the proposal, and within 2 months, the proposed policy was amended to maintain emphasis on genitals rather than self-identity as the determiner of gender. Transgender people in New York could have their sex reflected on their birth certificate, but like the requirement to compete in the Olympics, they would have to provide proof of unchangeable genital surgery. By still allowing for gender transitions but requiring genital surgery to do so, the Board of Health attempted to balance biology-based and identity-based gender models that had collided with the announcement of the proposed change to the policy. The resulting policy did the gender naturalization work of symbolically restoring the primacy of bodies for determining gender. Next case, case 3. The media coverage of the transgender rights bills we analyzed also attempted to embrace self-determination of gender. Typically, these bills provide no explicit surgical criteria for trans people who seek access to sex-segregated public accommodations that don't align with the gender that they were labeled at birth. Instead, transgender rights bills, both at the federal and the state level, offer protections for gender identity and gender expression in the realms of employment, housing, and public accommodations. The federal version of this bill, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, was first proposed in Congress in 1994. In its original form, the bill only included sexual orientation. After a great deal of protest from trans activists, most versions since 2007, that certain organizations that will remain nameless, HRC, have not gotten a hold of, have included protections for transgender individuals. These policies don't explicitly require sex reassignment surgery in order to gain access to these rights. Rather, the bills give value to gender self-determination by using vague terms such as gender identity and gender expression or transgender expression without providing a clear definition as to who counts for such categories. And there's a reason activists do that, but it results in gender panic. So the gender panics surrounding transgender rights bills center on this lack of definitional criteria. In response to a proposed transgender bill in New Hampshire in 2009, some opponents worried that the bill, quote, did not adequately define transgender individuals. A similar argument was raised about a 2009 Massachusetts bill, with concerned citizens worrying about the bill's language of transgender identity and expression, saying it's too vague and created dangerous ambiguity over who was legally transgender, and therefore who had access to men's or women's bathrooms. Right? Originally, these bills are supposed to be about making it safe to work, right? That you're allowed to have a job and people can't deny you access to housing or fire you because you're trans. But what this becomes about is about bathrooms. So much so that these bills have been dubbed bathroom bills by opponents. At stake for opponents appears to be the lack of regulatory agency or explicit bodily criteria for trans people who seek access to sex-segregated spaces. Highlighting this concern, one opponent in Massachusetts noted, "The bill opens the barn door to everyone. There's no way to know who is of the opposite sex is using the bathroom facility for the right purpose." In these cases, what appears to critics as too much validation of gender self-identity sets off a gender panic. In the cases we analyzed, the panic is not assuaged by policymakers introducing requirements for genital surgery, but rather people's opposition appears to be calmed when the bills just don't pass. Right? So the other ones, the gender panic is quelled by saying, okay, we'll require some sort of bodily change. These ones, the panic goes away by simply making it so the bill doesn't pass. By creating bodily criteria to determine under what circumstances trans people should be seen as men or women, the IOC and New York City policies shore up fissures created in a strict two-gender category model of gender by the visibility of trans people, while also allowing for some degree of self-determination, right? They're attempting to balance this value of self-identity and this body-based gender ideology. Like judicial rulings permitting the name and sex marker changes on documents, policies deciding the sex on a birth certificate or of an athlete for the purpose of competition work to balance liberal values with the desire to maintain the belief that there are two genders and that all bodies, trans or cisgender, can be put in one category or the other. Yet, as I'm going to show in the next section, this work didn't center on sex-segregated spaces evenly, or on all parts of the body that could be used as criteria for determining sex or gender. Rather, opposition gathered around the question of what can be seen as people with penises in spaces designated as women only. In our three cases, concerned citizens and journalists posed many questions about what genitals would be allowed in which sex-segregated spaces. This overwhelming focus on genitalia as the determiner of true gender is interesting when you consider other possible criteria. Within biology-based gender ideology, sex is determined at birth by doctors upon the visible recognition of genitalia, with male equals penis and female generally equaling no penis. Right? We have this idea that what women are penisless creatures. We don't have an idea of women's genitals culturally, interestingly enough. However, such sex categorization is assumed by many to be the result of invisible biological factors, namely chromosomes and hormones. Like sex and gender, these biological forces are seen as binary, right? With XX and estrogen creating females, and XY and testosterone creating males, which of course isn't totally accurate because of course both males and females have estrogen and testosterone. While genitalia and hormones can be manipulated, chromosomes are static, meaning on some level, XY and XX, if you wanted a fixed definition of gender, would be the best choice. In our analysis, such an emphasis on chromosomes emerged a few times from opponents of identity-based gender ideologies, but with much less frequency than the discussion of genitals. And that less weight is given to chromosomes in these cases of gender determination suggests that identity-based gender ideologies have gained some degree of cultural legitimacy, right? That it's something that's changeable that determines gender, indicates some valuing of identity-based gender ideologies. Because to balance both ideologies, you can't use unchangeable criteria such as chromosomes. Illustrating this, when the New York Supreme Court ruled that Renee Richards could be allowed to compete as a woman, the judge called using the chromosome test as a sole criteria of sex grossly unfair, discriminatory, and inequitable. So genitalia are the primary determiner of gender in all of our cases. Looking at the sports case, the case with the most clearly defined criteria for determining gender, chromosomes do not determine eligibility for sports competition. Instead, trans women, who generally have XY chromosomes, are allowed to compete as women as long as they undergo the removal of the testes and the penis. While testes are a source of testosterone, and testosterone is a central concern in policing trans people in sports, it's not clearly stated why trans women athletes must remove the penis to compete as women. Such a requirement may be in part due to deep cultural beliefs that all people with penises are men. Thus, although penises themselves don't provide an advantage in sports, right, and they could in fact be a disadvantage, many people believe that a person with a penis cannot possibly be a woman, and so they cannot compete with women in athletics. In addition, sports policies define the category of woman as the appropriate category for those bodies that are weaker than men. And the penis is seen as a sign of strength, so perhaps that's why they require its removal. Moreover, this may be a result of a widely held belief that people with penises present a danger to women, a question that I'm going to take up in depth later in this talk. This focus on aligning bodies and identities in normative ways is not applied equally to all athletes. Rather, this emphasis on determining gender through bodily criteria, here hormone levels and genitalia, is applied only to athletes attempting to compete as women. If an athlete competing as a woman has her gender called into question, this usually happens when a woman performs too well to be seen as a proper woman, then her hormone levels are tested. In contrast, people who want to compete as men, either cis or trans, are allowed to inject testosterone if their levels are seen as lower than those of an average man. Thus, in this sex-gender sexuality system, testosterone is the right of people claiming the category of men. Further, while no athlete with a penis can compete as a woman, athletes are not required to have a penis in order to compete as a man. So, for instance, Will, who's an Australian trans man playing football as a man on a men's team, has not been required to have proof of a surgically constructed penis to compete. He's required to have his sex legally changed, and under Victorian law, this requires a hysterectomy, but not a phalloplasty. Moreover, his use of testosterone is not seen as an attempt to cheat or gain an unfair advantage over other men, as his levels do not exceed those of a typical cisgender man. I focused extensively on the sports case as the IOC criteria are the most explicit among our three cases. But the pattern you see here, the heightened attention on the presence or absence of a penis in spaces marked as women only, was reflected in all of our cases. In news stories about the New York birth certificate case and the transgender rights case, opponents of gender self-determination frequently hinge their concerns on what they term male anatomies or male genitalia in women's spaces, because in proper news coverage, apparently you don't say penis. So instead you say that they are worried about male anatomies in women's restrooms, in women's prisons, etc. So a common gender panic scenario described by challengers to this policy was that trans women who still had male anatomies would be housed with female prisoners. Another regular illustration was that of trans women who, quote, still have male genitalia in women's bathrooms. While several articles included interviews with trans men activists who often emphasized how hard it would be for them as people with facial hair to be forced to use a women's restroom on the basis of their legal sex, opponents of in the same articles almost always use the example of trans women in women's bathrooms, right? So if you talk to trans activists, you find discussions of what's going to happen for trans men, but if you look at opponents to gender self-determination, it is always trans women in women's spaces that is the source of gender panic. Thus, biology-based gender ideologies were more likely to be deployed when debating transgender access to women's spaces, and those debates reveal that it is penises rather than other biological aspects that are the primary determiner of gender. As I'm going to detail in the next section, this is because male anatomies are framed as sexual threats towards women. In our three cases, women's only spaces, whether sports teams, bathrooms, prison cells, or locker rooms, generate the most concern for those who see institutional policies as giving too much validation to gender self-determination. In the resulting gender panics, ideas about fairness and safety work to naturalize not just innate gender differences, but also to maintain unequal gender relations in the sex-gender sexuality system. Within this rhetoric, two persistent cultural ideologies about womanhood are deployed to counter gender self-determination. Right? This is how you counter access to trans rights, is the idea that women are weaker than men and that, as a result, women are always at sexual risk from men. This construction produces woman as what I've called in previous work of mine, a vulnerable subjecthood, which is meaning that an idea to be part of that category is that you are constantly in danger and unable to defend yourself. Conversely, men, or more specifically penises, are imagined as sources of persistent and constant heterosexual threat to women and children, an idea that reinforces a construction of heterosexual male desire as natural and boundless. Women's spaces are thus androphobic and, as a result, heterophobic, due to the assumed inability of women to protect themselves from men, combined with an assumption that men are all potential rapists. Which, for the guys out here, that should be a concerning message, right? That what it is to be you is to be someone who goes around attacking women. Right? It's not just constraining on women to make an argument that we're vulnerable to danger. It's constraining to men to say that you must be in some way criminal. These cultural constructions of gender and the heterophobia of women-only spaces carry enough cultural import to stop many policies from validating gender self-determination, right? It is this fear, the androphobia and heterophobia, that makes it so that trans people are then not allowed to access the spaces they want to access. So ultimately, what people are attempting to protect here, Kristen and I suggest, is not women, but rather the binary logic that sex-segregated spaces are both predicated on and reproduce, right? We're not protecting women by saying men are dangerous to women and shouldn't be allowed in bathrooms. Instead, we're protecting the idea that men and women are opposite and unequal. Within the sports case, the IOC focused on the issues of fairness, whether or not trans women athletes have an unfair advantage over cis women when determining when a trans woman could compete with cis women. In attempting to maintain both the values of self-determination and the logic of gender difference that justifies sex-segregated athletic competitions, sports officials such as the IOC forced trans women athletes into a peculiar situation. In order to gain access to a chance to compete in tests of strength and endurance, they must first prove their weakness. This equation of women with weakness also accounts for the regulation of women's, but not men's, sports, as if women are inherently weak, they must be protected from competing with stronger bodies, meaning men, while cis men do not need such protection from people with XX chromosomes. Gender panics around the issue of trans athletes also focused on the question of safety, right? So the two big words that came up when looking at these cases is a question of fairness and a question of safety. For example, the United Kingdom's 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which was a law intended to grant more rights to transgender people, includes a provision that prohibits trans athletes' competition in cases that endanger, quote, the safety of competitors. Discussion of safety in this case only revolved around regulating access to contact sports. So trans athletes could not compete against cis athletes in contact sports, where you might bump into each other and men's inherent superiority would squish the women's. The underlying assumption here is that male-bodied people in contact with female-bodied people endanger them. This reproduces the idea of men and women as opposite and constructs transsexual women, because of their assumed maleness, as inherently dangerous to women. Additionally, during the debate of this act, an interesting other discussion of what safety meant emerged. So one of the opponents to the act said that many people will be greatly concerned at the idea of themselves or their children being forced to share a changing room with a transsexual person. This portrayal of transgender people as potential sexual dangers in sex-segregated spaces appeared repeatedly in our other two cases. And this is a website set up to oppose these bathroom bills. So people opposed to policy changes that would give greater validation to gender self-determination over biological credentials made repeated arguments about the need to protect women from the threat of sexual assault that would be imminent should such policies be enacted. Such arguments position women, and often children, another group that's seen as having a vulnerable subjecthood, as at sexual risk from people with penises who would now legally be able to enter women's only spaces. Explaining his opposition to the transgender rights bill, New Hampshire Representative Derry noted parents are worried about their kids and sexual abuse. In addition, when opponents to the change in the New York City birth certificate policies expressed concerns about whether prisoners with altered birth certificates could be housed with female prisoners, even if they still had male anatomies. When they're doing this, they're hinting at the possibility that those male anatomies would sexually assault the women with whom they shared a prison space. While most of the articles we looked at just hinted at this possibility, a few were more explicit. For example, this one. An opinion piece argued that one of the dangers of the proposed law was, quote, personal safety. Many communal spaces, like prison cells and public bathrooms, are segregated by sex to protect women, who are generally physically weaker than men, from assault or rape. In this defensive moment, opponents to self-determination both rely on and shore up an idea that women are uniquely susceptible to assault, thus affirming woman as this vulnerable subject position. As the panics produced in these moments of ideology collision do not focus on all genders equally, and instead focus on one body part as uniquely terrifying, gender panics might more accurately be termed penis panics. In these narratives, opponents give penises the power to destroy the sanctity of women's spaces through their presumed natural propensity to rape. And this penis panic takes three forms. The first is this general fear, where people say that women or children are going to be put at risk, but don't specify who it is that they fear is going to do the assaulting. The second form of penis panic is that this fear that cisgender men will pretend to be women in order to get access to bathrooms and sexually assault people. So this bill is an invitation, it seems to me, to people with predatory tendencies to come and hide behind the fact that they're having a transgender experience. Or the anti-discrimination bill would allow sexual predators to enter women's restrooms under the guise of, quote, gender confusion. The third form of penis panic is actually saying that transgender women themselves would be the threat. This is the least common fear that's said. So there's a story that gets passed around about, I've already heard of a transgendered man, meaning a trans woman, but who claimed at work to be a woman in a man's body, but is a lesbian, who had to be expelled from the ladies' room because he was propositioning women there. Here, trans women are seen as people who now have legal permission to enter sex-segregated spaces, but without the proper biological credentials. As such, their presence makes a non-sexual space into a dangerously heterosexual one. In all of these arguments, there's a presumption of heterosexual desire and male strength. Within this heteronormative logic, all bodies with male anatomies, regardless of gender identity, desire female bodies, and many of them, at least enough to elicit concern and panic, are willing to use force to get access to these bodies, right? So this is an interesting assumption about what it is to be male. To be male is to desire women and to be willing to use force to get access to those bodies. The emphasis on the potentiality for sexual assault in women's only spaces is worth further analysis, as women share space with men daily without the same sort of panic. So like, why is this panic happening? Why the fear of men in women's spaces, since women interact with men pretty daily without a fear of being assaulted? So women's only spaces generate intense androphobia because by definition these spaces should not contain bodies with male anatomies. These are, in other words, penis-free zones. If women are inherently vulnerable to violence and unable to protect themselves, and men are inherently dangerous, then the entrance of a man into women's space becomes uniquely terrifying because there's no other men to protect the women from potential assault by a male invader. The safe space is immediately transformed into a dangerous sexual situation by the entrance of a male body, who's imagined here as sort of like a fox in a henhouse, right? Where the women are unable to protect themselves, they would need another fox in there to save them, or perhaps a dog of some sort. That they can't protect themselves, therefore this is terrifying. These fears rely on and reproduce a gender binary, specifically the assumption that all men are strong and all women are weak. As opponents assume that people with penises are inherently stronger than cis women and would easily be able to overpower them and assault them. This emphasis on the sexual threat of penises in women-only spaces shows that gender panics are not just about gender, but they're also deeply about sexuality. All bodies in these spaces are presumed to be heterosexual, and this assumption makes sex-segregated spaces seem safe because they're seen as sexuality-free zones. Unlike many sexual panics, here the panic isn't over homosexual sex, but instead in deep fear of unwanted heterosexual sex. So, as I said before, these spaces are heterophobic. As heterosexual sex is seen as very much a danger to women and children, but rarely, if ever, a danger to men, it is only women's and children's spaces that are policed. This differential policing of trans people in sex-segregated spaces illustrates the cultural logics that uphold gender inequality and heteronormativity, two systems that rely on male-female oppositeness. So, conclusions. In this talk, I've examined the process of determining gender, and I've demonstrated that collisions of biology-based and identity-based gender ideologies in the liberal moment have produced a sex-gender sexuality system where the criteria for determining gender vary across interactional contexts. Many people have long assumed that biological markers such as chromosomes are always the ultimate determiner of gender and sex category. Contrary to this dominant assumption, Kristen and I suggest that the sex-gender sexuality system is slowly changing. As it has encountered liberal values of self-determination, the criteria for determining gender have shifted away from pure biological determinism. The system now allows for self-determination of gender, but it has limits and is space-specific. In non-sexual integrated spaces, identity is used to determine gender, as long as that identity is as clearly a man or clearly a woman. By contrast, in sex-segregated spaces, the combination of identity and body-based criteria are used, allowing someone to receive cultural and institutional support for a change of gender only if they undergo genital surgery. While most cisgender people keep the same classification in all spaces, transgender people may be given different gender classifications by social actors depending on the type of interaction occurring in the space. So you can speak of a trans person's social gender, their sexual gender, and their sports or other sex-segregated space gender. So to illustrate this point, Chi alums, who's pictured here, who's a trans man who plays college basketball on a women's team, has a social gender of man and a sports gender of woman. So different genders in different spaces in this current moment of beliefs about gender. Under the definitional criteria for trans athletes, he is able to play as a woman because he hasn't had genital surgery and he's not on testosterone, but in social spaces he is seen as a boy. The criteria for gender determination vary across social spaces, as I've said before, because of the imagined purpose of these spaces. So heterosexual encounters and sex-segregated spaces both justify and reproduce an idea of two opposite genders. So spaces that require a high level of oppositeness, we find the use of bodily-based criteria, versus spaces that don't require a high level of oppositeness, such as the workplace. It is acceptable then to allow trans people to portray their identity of choice without changing their bodies. And validation of gender self-determination is more likely to occur when such validation cannot be framed as endangering other people, particularly other people seen as more worthy of protection than trans people, such as cis women and children. These attitudes have profound consequences for transgender rights, as such rights are much more likely to be granted when they're not understood as endangering another group. As we've discussed, the criteria is different in men's spaces versus women's. I focused on the women's spaces here because that's what came up in the news coverage that we looked at. Trans women in these cases are portrayed as dangerous because they're thought to use their womanly appearance to gain access to women's only spaces, tricking women into trusting them, feeling safe, and letting them into their sex-free zone where there's no men to protect them. To use another agricultural metaphor here, trans women are then perceived as wolves in sheep's clothing in these spaces. Why does this happen? Why only women's spaces? Because heterosexual sex is seen as dangerous to women, but not to men, so there's no need to regulate access to men's spaces. But why genitals? Why not focus on chromosomes? Our research hints at 4 possible answers. First, genitals are changeable, unlike chromosomes. Thus, using genitals allows for some validation of identity-based gender ideologies. 2, male and female genitals are imagined to be opposite, so using them as a criteria for determining gender maintains this idea that men and women are in fact opposite. Third, genitals play a central role in these gender panics or penis panics because gender and sexuality are inextricably intertwined. The social actors opposed to gender self-determination assume that all bodies, regardless of gender identity, are heterosexual, and that having heterosexually identified bodies in these spaces will create danger for women. Finally, by using genitals as a criteria for determining gender, the sex-gender sexuality system is able to adapt to new liberal ideals of self-determination and to withstand the threat that trans people might pose to a rigid binary system of gender. Although the existence of transgender and genderqueer people is seen as capable of undoing gender, and there's been a lot of scholarship on whether trans people will undo gender, the bionistic gender system tends to adapt and reabsorb or repatriate trans people. Thus, rather than being undone, gender is constantly redone. People create gender, like all norms and social systems, and this produces enormous flexibility, slowly altering as people interact with it. Challenges to the gender system do not break it, but instead simply modify it. In the liberal moment of gender, the criteria for determining gender have been modified to accommodate new values of self-determination. By accepting trans people into the existing two gender categories in the ways done for sex-segregated spaces, the premises that maintain the sex-gender sexuality system, that there's only two genders, that they're opposite, and that gender is based in biology, are maintained. So while the liberal moment accepts identity and accepts the crossing of categories, it does not accept fluidity and insists on a rigid binary. By providing criteria for who can transition and how they do it, the sex-gender sexuality system is altered but maintained. Thank you. Questions? Alternative analyses. Yeah.
How did you get involved in this kind of research?
My dissertation
Turn it on.
research on violence against trans people started because I have a lot of friends who have experienced violence, and I got interested in why it was that cisgender people responded with violence against trans people. In terms of how Kristen and I started working together, she gave a talk at the school I was getting my PhD at, and we had a chat afterwards and realized how close our dissertation data was, and that we could use it together to make an argument about what was going on with this process of determining gender. Other questions?
Michigan Research has an alternative.
Well, I would like you to speak into my voice.
Michigan recently passed a gender identity clause where you can now change your gender identity and sex legally and have those documents sealed without surgery. And I was wondering, how do you interpret the difference between the Michigan backlash and the New York backlash?
And if I was teaching, I would throw it out to the group and be like, what do you guys think? But it's too big of a group. My guess is it's a change of time, right? So the New York backlash is 2006, it's 2012, and we're having this slowly shifting gender system where we're becoming more and more accepting of self-identity versus biology-based, labeling of gender. And so that would be why there would be less backlash here, where you could actually pass a policy versus that. New York, the political movement that produced was shockingly enormous to the activists at the time, right? They thought it was just easy to get it passed, but it was because of this terror of trans women in prisons and that. Does that answer? Other questions?
I was just wondering, there's a lot of commissions that are kind of creating a more fluid structure for identifying transgender. Is there any sort of current movement towards moving that into a larger scale, like you actually actively disseminating this information, like to even schools or to the larger population at large? I mean, a lot of this is stuff that I really don't hear much about, and I'm just wondering. I mean, other than workshops like this, I don't really see a lot of that on a large scale. So I was wondering if you knew of anything that was
So are groups working towards transgender rights doing this on sort of national scale and talking about these particular issues or access to bathrooms and stuff like that? Is that the question?
Like, yeah, just large scale information.
So our larger LGBT organizations have a very troubled history with transgender rights. These organizations started out as gay rights organizations and then realized that lesbians existed and added an L and then slowly added 2 other letters without really necessarily always incorporating those rights ideas. So my nasty comment about the HRC is that the HRC has been really bad about lots of transgender rights issues. And so what activists have done instead is start their own groups that are separate from these large LGBT umbrella national organizations because of this troubled history. Some groups try to work within it. And not all folks are as bad as the HRC in terms of trans rights. On college campuses, there's a big movement towards gender-neutral bathrooms and gender-neutral housing, and there are central organizations helping to put together flyers and talking points so you can talk to college administrators. On this campus, there's been that activism done a little bit, but apparently not loud enough. And different college campuses are doing that nationwide. So there are, right now, there's been a sort of disintegration of larger trans national organizations. Gender Pact was the big trans national organization, and Gender Pact moved to, they didn't want to do trans rights specifically anymore, they wanted to do gender equality in general, and that upset enough people, and there's enough internal conflict that Gender Pact died. So what's happening now instead is smaller groups online doing this work, and a lot of college students trying to spread word about access to spaces and stuff. Other questions?
Just a shout out about Grand Valley. We do have gender neutral housing now, but we have a serious lack of gender neutral bathrooms. The ones that we have, as well as the ones we don't have, are listed on our website.
You briefly discussed in the OIC segregating people by gender. What would you suggest as a solution to that? If we couldn't just have one mass for one event, because then people who are born with a female body type would feel naturally disadvantageous. So what would be your solution?
Right, so you're saying, all right, how do we do sports, right?
Yes.
Like, what should have happened in my mind, in my perfect world with the Olympics most recently? So lots of people argue that men are naturally stronger than women and better at all sports. It's not actually true. So things like ski jump, right, where because you're feeling suicidal, you go down this thing and fly in the air and try to turn yourself into a little kite and go for as far as possible. Women actually jump farther than men in ski jump because women weigh less than men on average. And they actually have a huge problem with anorexia among male ski jump athletes because they're trying to get their bodies as small as possible so they can go farther. Interestingly, ski jump is one of the only events that doesn't have a women's competition in the Olympics. And you can hypothesize why that might be. I think that if we allowed men and women to compete together, women's athletic abilities would rise up in the ways that you've seen on things like marathon. And I wish I had the data to throw up. If you look at marathon times over time, women, when they first were allowed to finally run a marathon, right, past marathons, women were not allowed to compete and they snuck in. And you have really interesting photos of official bodyguards yanking women out of the marathon because it's, I don't know, too dangerous to the world for women to run next to men. But when they first started, women were really slow, and then slowly, as there became more and more support for women marathon runners, their times decreased pretty dramatically, and they're not that far off from men. And if you look at women who win marathons, they beat out a lot of men, right? There's a whole lot of dudes behind them. So this argument that women can't compete with men, I think is something that we created in this moment because of our idea that women are inherently weak, that if we actually allowed folks to compete together, we might find out they have really similar abilities. The other option is to actually promote athletic competitions that play on women's strengths, so lower center of gravity, more leg muscle, as opposed to men's strength, which is height and arm muscle. And if we had athletic competitions that valued women's strengths, women would, of course, do a whole lot better. With kids here in Michigan, up until a certain age, tend to compete together. right? There's soccer teams with boys and girls together. And doing something like that, but continuing on, I think we'd actually find a very similar level of abilities. That would be my ideal world. Yeah.
I was just going to add that kind of the boxing world, or is one where you have different categories of height, weight categories. Would be another.
Right. So if we grouped people not based off gender, but based off certain ability or idea of ability. Right now, boxing, we separate by weight and by gender. With this odd requirement right now that women boxers wear skirts. So then you're sure that, it's girls beating each other up. So yeah, if we did a similar thing, group people by height or by average time and had them compete against the people similar to them, then that would be a fair way to compete. Other questions?
What the heck?
I fear this one. Hi, Jeff.
It seems to me that you just explained that we could put more attention on sports, that women have a more natural strength than men, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was right after sort of categorically denying that men have a natural strength in any sport. Right?
Okay.
So
I said that I think we find men and women to be more similar in their abilities. Now, on average, are male bodies different than female bodies in some ways? Totally. Do our sports tend to value the ways in which male bodies are superior? Things that involve height and weight and running into each other really hard? Yes. So could we do a different model? Totally. There are slight differences in men's and women's bodies, right? I couldn't possibly stand here and say like men and women are identical. But they're not as great as we currently understand, right? The ways we've altered women's sports so that women can compete is totally not actually necessary, right? What we've done with basketball, we shrink the ball down and lower the net. Women can play basketball with men's balls and height, right? When women could play against men, some women would beat out most men. We currently have an idea that you must keep them completely separate because all men are superior to all women. Now, the guys in here, can you think of a female athlete who could totally beat you at a number of competitions? All of them, yes. So acknowledging that. Other questions?
Why do you say like it has to be like a man is superior to a woman when there's just a difference? So therefore, a woman is a woman and a man is a man, so we play separate sports. Because you keep saying how like, oh, if you have a penis, you're better, but you have a penis and someone else doesn't. So therefore, it's different. And I feel like there's a lot of qualitative information you're throwing out versus quantity, because versus like numbers and statistics, because men do rape women, and it is scary. And I know if like a man walked in the back, and that might be scary. Not seeing a transgender person who appears to be a woman, that's different. But you were throwing out there something that didn't really deal with transgender things, and I was just wondering, like, where do you stand on that? Like, 'cause I feel like you keep using that as a, you know what I'm trying to say?
Right, okay, so if you heard me say that people with penises are superior, then I misspoke. What I was attempting to convey was that the data that Kristen and I looked at, the newspaper coverage of these cases, repeatedly said that there was a fear of male genitalia, by which they mean penises, in these spaces. And then what's implicit here, what the assumption is that all people with penises are stronger than people who don't have penises, and that those people with penises will try to assault the people without penises, right? That's the assumption. And I think it's a problematic assumption. Male-bodied folks are not all stronger than all female-bodied folks, and most men aren't rapists. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
Similarly, not all women are weak and unable to protect themselves, right? But we teach our girls that they're weak and unable to protect themselves. We teach our girls that if someone tries to assault them, what they should do is run away, or maybe say, ow, stop, don't, but not punch somebody in the nose. Or we don't train our girls how to do that. So we've created a situation where men are stronger than women and likely to be successful with a sexual assault because of how we've raised our children. Right? We teach boys that they should be assertive and aggressive, and we have a narrative that men rape. And we teach our girls to be submissive and not fight back. My other work is on self-defense training, and lots of self-defense training for girls tells them, run away and find an adult. that is what you should do to protect yourself, which has a gendered lesson, right? I am unable to protect myself, I need someone else to protect me. I need another fox in the hen house to save me. So what I was attempting to convey was the dominant understandings in the data we looked at, not my own personal beliefs. And yes, it was very qualitative. It's not quantitative at all because we're doing qualitative-based research. I could give you counts of quotes, like how many quotes mentioned a fear of male genitalia and how many didn't. It's not particularly helpful though, because some articles will have lots of things from opponents and only a few things from supporters, and it's hard to know how much that got spread. So yes, very qualitative, and that's just happens to be the sort of work I did for this project. Did that help answer some of those questions though? Last questions?
Thank you. I'd just like to say a little bit of a comment as you described how sometimes women will be questioned on their sports ability because they're doing too well. And I'd just like to say as a devil's advocate that the exact same thing will happen for men. And it is something that's done about steroids. And baseball is a very big thing that I could quote.
Perfect.
There was, I know, recently in the last Olympics, we had a woman who was swimming milliseconds behind Michael Phelps, and they tested her for steroids, and I personally don't find anything wrong with that. If you're swimming as fast as the fastest swimmer in the world, that's just fair to all females in that entire race,
The difference though is they're tested for different things though, right? So men who are competing too well are tested for what?
Steroids.
Steroids. Women who are competing too well are tested for what? Being a man, right? So
And
there's
steroids.
a different
And steroids.
and steroids, but there's a fear that they are men, right? So what happened with Caster Semenya was that she won too many times, and she looked masculine, which you have to look at intersectionality here. There's an assumption about what appropriate female presentation is. It has something to do with whiteness. And so she was seen as doing too well and sort of mannish, and therefore she had her gender tested, right? So the news coverage was like, winning athlete gets sex test. Where you never see this for guys, right? They don't get sex tested, they get tested for steroids, whereas women do. And you're saying, if you're using steroids, that should be wrong, and everyone who's using steroids should be punished. Totally, yes. The question here is, what do you do with athletes who, is it fair that an athlete who does very well and is seen as mannish because of her gender presentation, that she gets pulled aside and sex tested and pulled out of competition for 2 years? And you have to remember, she was 16 when this started. Could you imagine being a 16-year-old and having your face across the news saying your sex is being tested? It really puts a dent in your day, right? So that's the difference, right?
Well, just to build off of that, because that is a logistic possibility. A man could, in order to up his establishment, compete on women's level and excel, as I would parallel that to maybe that Johnny Knoxville film where he pretended to be special education in order to compete in the Special Olympics and excel beyond that. So it is a possibility.
It is. In all of the years of the Olympics, only one man has ever been caught competing as a woman, and that was during the Olympics in Berlin. The Nazi Party had a man compete in women's high jump. He did not win. He lost. He did not beat out the other women high jumpers, but there has been one case of that, but none other in all of the years of the Olympics with all of the sex testing that's happened.
Right. I don't think that it's good that they do that, but I do think that it's just fair for every female competing in the competition.
Okay. And I'm saying that it produces an idea that women are inherently weak and that we should call that into question.
Right.
That we should either sex test everyone, if we think that sex is important, or sex test no one.
This doesn't have anything to do with sports, thank God. No offense, I'm just not into them. But I was just wondering about, you focus a lot on trans women, which I actually appreciate because I don't think that, trans people in general get enough attention. they're struggling with. But my question, I guess, is regarding trans men in men's bathrooms. And I don't necessarily think that I understood this correctly, but it kind of sounded like you were kind of brushing that off, like, oh, well, it's like safe for trans men to go into men's bathrooms. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And like, I guess what I'm wondering is not so much like, you know, trying to prove a point like that, but wondering how you would tie that into gender inequality.
Right, so it's not me who didn't think that trans men's experiences are important. It's that when we're looking at moments where identity-based gender ideology and body-based gender ideology come into collision, who is it that they talk about? And what we find is that cisgender people, who are the ones who are being interviewed and who are writing these newspaper stories, are terrified of trans women that they imagine having penises in women's spaces, and they're not scared of trans men. Now, what does this mean for trans men? Does this mean that life is super easy for trans men everywhere? No. What this means is that there's an assumption inherent in this discussion, this dominant understanding of gender, where trans men aren't a threat. They're not dangerous. They don't have real penises, and therefore they are not dangerous in men's spaces, right? So they don't have to be regulated or policed. Does that mean it's safe for trans men in men's bathrooms? No, right? But that when cisgender people think of what trans person they're afraid of trans women who are seen as having penises in women's spaces, and they're not afraid of trans men in men's spaces because they're not seen as real men, right? Trans men in these narratives are conceptualized as fake men who are sort of cute and would go into these spaces and would somehow be, you know, not dangerous to cis people. But it looks like you have a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess what I meant to focus on more is actually just the bathroom piece, and like, why do you think that it is sort of unsafe for trans men to be in men's bathrooms regarding gender inequality? Like, how does that tie? How does that all tie together? Do you have any ideas?
Right. Well, I think that people are, so I think trans men are not a homogenous group, right? So trans men experience different levels of risk of violence in different spaces depending on gender presentation. So to the extent that a trans man has been chooses to take testosterone, right? That's a choice, right? Chooses to take testosterone, has been on T for a long time, has visible facial hair, has had top surgery. In terms of my studies of violence, those people are not at super high risks of violence in men's bathrooms. Now, to the extent that there's a trans man who does not pass, and that's an incredibly problematic term, so it gets huge body air quotes, does not pass as well, that person's going to be at higher risk for violence. Why? Because people who are gender non-conforming in our society are generally at risk for violence, where people get terrified that I can't gender you properly and you're in my super gendered space, right? Bathrooms are the space that is super gendered. They're there to create this idea of oppositeness. Versus at home, we all pee in the same place, right? And nobody dies. But in public, we have to separate it because we have this idea that we must create this idea that men and women are opposite. And so when you have a gender non-conforming body in that space, that can freak people out, and they need to police that. Does that help?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Remaining questions? All right, you guys have been lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please hand in your evaluations as you leave, and thank you very much for attending today's program.
Thank you, Charlie.